Imagine you are a woman in ancient Greece around 400 BCE. You have been short of breath, dizzy, maybe anxious for weeks. You finally consult a physician. He is not an idiot. He trained in the best medical tradition available. He asks a few questions, presses your abdomen, and then tells you that your womb has drifted upward toward your chest. He recommends that you sit over a pot of foul-smelling smoke, so the womb will flee back down to its proper place. If that does not work, he suggests you get married and pregnant as quickly as possible. This was not a fringe belief. The wandering womb was one of the most successful bad ideas in medical history. It lasted, in different forms, for more than 1,000 years. And it was not just a mistake about anatomy. It became a way of explaining almost anything about a woman's body that men could not see or control. So if you want to understand what life was actually like for women in the ancient world, the wandering womb is not the whole story. It is the door. Behind it is a much stranger, more dangerous, and more human story about what it meant to live in a body that everyone, including the doctors, misunderstood. The story starts earlier. Menarche. For an ancient girl, her first period was not usually a private medical event. It was a social signal. In many Greek and Roman communities, it meant she could now be married and expected to produce children. The average age of menarche then may have been later than today, often in the early to mid-teens, though poor nutrition could delay it. But marriage could follow soon after. A Roman girl could be legally married at 12. Many elite families married daughters in their mid-teens. That meant a body still growing could be expected to carry a pregnancy. And the bleeding itself? Well, there was no hormonal explanation. There was no knowledge of ovulation or the endometrial cycle. There was only the plain observable fact. A healthy woman could bleed for days and not die. That is strange enough. But she could also grow an entire human inside her body. A male body cannot do either of those things. If you have no concept of hormones, those are not everyday biological processes. They look like supernatural events. By the 1st century CE, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder had compiled an encyclopedia called Natural History. He was a serious and curious man. He also wrote that menstrual blood could turn new wine sour, make crops barren, rust iron, and drive dogs mad if they licked it. He was not being ironic. He was collecting what he believed were facts. That belief wasn't random. It came from pattern seeking. Menstruation was visible, recurring, emotionally charged, and linked to fertility. In the absence of better information, ancient people imbued it with power, danger, and magic. Now, think about the actual experience behind that mythology. The real menstrual cycle in the ancient world involved cramps, headaches, back pain, heavy bleeding, and sometimes anemia. There were no reliable painkillers. Willow bark could help some, but it wasn't always available. Managing the blood meant folded cloth, wool, plant fibers, maybe papyrus or grass. Rich women had better cloth. Poor women used whatever they could wash and reuse. None of it was comfortable. And because cloth and plant fibers rot, archaeologists find almost no trace of these objects. The historical record is nearly silent. That absence does not mean menstruation was not a struggle. It means the materials of that struggle disappeared. So now imagine you are a doctor in that world, and a woman comes to you with shortness of breath, palpitations, anxiety, fainting. You don't have blood tests or imaging. You have a theory. The uterus is a living animal that moves. The symptoms of anxiety and hyperventilation, rapid heartbeat, chest tightness, dizziness, look like the uterus has climbed. The treatment follows logically from the belief. That is how a respiratory or psychological symptom became a reproductive one. The word hysteria comes from hystera, Greek for uterus. From the start, it was not a neutral diagnosis. It said your symptoms are caused by your female organs. And because the recommended cure was often marriage and pregnancy, the diagnosis also served a social agenda. If a woman was miserable, unmarried, or menstruating painfully, the prescription was not rest or pain relief. It was to fulfill her biological role. But here is the first surprise. Ancient medicine was not one unified, stupid thing. Around the 1st and 2nd century CE, a Greek physician named Soranus of Ephesus wrote a gynecological textbook in Rome. He rejected the wandering womb as nonsense. He said the uterus is not an animal, it does not roam, and many of the dramatic cures were harmful. He recommended gentle care, hygiene, olive oil, wool, and a calm environment. His description of childbirth includes instructions for midwives. Keep the mother comfortable. Do not force the baby. Support the perineum. Cut the cord carefully. Some of it still reads like modern guidance. That matters because Soranus did not invent these practices from pure theory. He almost certainly learned them from midwives. The women who actually attended births had generations of practical knowledge, but they rarely wrote it down. Soranus, a literate male physician, took their craft and put it into a book. That's how history often works. The person holding the pen gets credit. Let's go into the room where ancient women actually gave birth. A Greek or Roman woman would typically labor at home, attended by a midwife and female relatives. There might be a birthing stool with a crescent-shaped seat. The midwife might use olive oil as a lubricant. She might massage the abdomen. If the baby was positioned badly, she might try to turn it manually. But if the baby couldn't descend, there were no forceps, no vacuum, no safe surgical delivery. The mother pushed for hours or days. The baby might die. Infection could follow. Hemorrhage could not be stopped. The pain of labor in ancient times was likely not much different from labor today. But it happened without anesthesia, without sterile technique, and without the option of an emergency cesarean for a living mother. In rare cases, if a woman died in labor, the baby might be cut from her body. The procedure existed mainly as a desperate last resort. A living woman subjected to that surgery would have bled to death. So, for all practical purposes, obstructed labor was a death sentence. Modern historians estimate that in many pre-industrial populations, something like 1 or 2% of births ended in the mother's death. That sounds small, but it compounds. 6 births means roughly a 1 in 10 chance you don't survive them. 10 births makes it even higher. Many ancient women were pregnant far more often. The cumulative risk colored everything. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice, and there was no way to know if you'd be the one. And the danger didn't end with death. There were lacerations, fistulas, prolapse, infection. Many women lived with injuries that modern medicine would repair, but in antiquity meant a lifetime of pain, incontinence, or social isolation. It is difficult to see in the written sources because the women who suffered often could not write their own stories. But the bodies tell us whenever we find them. Now, think about what that constant reproductive pressure did to the mind. A woman could not simply decide to avoid pregnancy. Contraception existed, but it was unreliable and sometimes dangerous. Abortion was practiced, but it was often risky. And in many societies, refusing to marry and bear children was not a realistic option for most free women. Which brings us to the most famous plant in ancient reproductive history, Silphium. Silphium was a giant fennel-like plant that grew only on a narrow coastal strip near Cyrene in modern Libya. It was so valuable that the city put it on its coins. People used its resin and stems for everything from seasoning to coughs. But its most famous use was as a contraceptive or early abortifacient. Women would drink a preparation made from the plant, and according to Greek and Roman sources, it worked. We don't know how effective it actually was. We don't know exactly how it worked. But the demand was so enormous that the plant was gone by late antiquity. The Romans reportedly could not find a single stalk. It may be the first recorded case of a species harvested to extinction for contraception. Some historians think the classic heart shape we use today may have been based on the seed pod of Silphium. That identification is contested, but it makes a certain sense. The symbol of love and romance may trace back to an ancient contraceptive. If true, the past has a very dry sense of humor. But most women could not get Silphium. They used what was available: acacia gum, honey, date palm, wool, and occasionally crocodile dung. The acacia gum recipe may have had some actual effect because it ferments into lactic acid, which is not friendly to sperm. The crocodile dung was likely just a good way to get an infection. But it tells you something important. Women were experimenting with their own bodies. They were not passively waiting to get pregnant. They wanted control. One of the oldest surviving medical texts, an Egyptian gynecological papyrus from around 1800 BCE, includes vaginal preparations and tests for pregnancy. It is less magical than you might expect, though it also has prescriptions that are hard to interpret. The very existence of the text tells us women's reproductive health was being treated as real medicine. But the text is damaged, fragmentary, and written by men. We are still looking at the female body through a narrow window. The people most likely to help with all this were other women, midwives. In ancient Greece, they were called maiai. In Rome, obstetresses. A good midwife was worth her weight in silver. Soranus listed the qualities. She should be literate, calm, strong, methodical, not greedy, not superstitious, and able to keep secrets. Some ancient legal documents show midwives were paid, could be enslaved or free, and sometimes testified in court about pregnancy or virginity. They were the first line of reproductive medicine, and yet not a single complete treatise by a woman physician from ancient Greece or Rome survives. The names of individual midwives occasionally appear on tombstones or in legal documents, but usually we know them only through the men who wrote about them. This is not because women had nothing to say, it is because they were excluded from the literate medical tradition. The women who actually delivered babies, treated infections, and helped with contraception were not usually the ones writing the record. There is a legend the Roman writer Hyginus told about a young Athenian woman named Agnotice. She supposedly disguised herself as a man to study medicine, then revealed herself to female patients. Male doctors accused her of seducing women, until the women of Athens rallied to her defense. The story is probably not true, but it survived because it captured something real. Male doctors were threatened by women caring for women. Female patients often preferred female practitioners, and the male medical establishment could not always tell the difference between treatment and transgression. All of this played out inside societies that saw a woman's body as a vessel for producing heirs. In Athens, a free woman's main legal purpose was to produce legitimate citizen children. In Rome, Emperor Augustus passed marriage laws that rewarded people for having more children and penalized the childless. A woman who had 3 or 4 children in Rome could gain legal independence from male guardianship. Her fertility was not just personal, it was political. That changed how she experienced pregnancy. It wasn't only a private event. The state cared how many babies she produced. For wealthy free women, motherhood could bring status, but for enslaved women, there was no such reward. An enslaved woman's body was not her own. She could be used for labor, sex, and reproduction. Her pregnancy might be encouraged because it produced more enslaved people. Her infant could be taken or exposed. The physical and emotional burden was the same, but the social meaning was entirely different. Ancient women did not share one struggle. They shared a biological reality that was then carved up by class, status, and law. Free women were also pressured to marry young. A girl in Athens might marry around 14 or 15. In Rome, the legal minimum for girls was 12. Marriage meant sex, and sex meant pregnancy. There was no reliable birth control, no safe abortion, and no understanding of ovulation. The result for many women was a life of repeated pregnancy and breastfeeding. Breastfeeding could delay ovulation, which might naturally space births. But if a wealthy woman used a wet nurse, she could become pregnant again sooner. Wealth was not always health. In fact, wealthy women sometimes had more pregnancies precisely because they did not breastfeed. Now combine all of this: monthly pain, dangerous pregnancies, repeated loss, no reliable birth control, constant social pressure. It should not surprise you that many ancient women experienced anxiety, depression, and what we would now call postpartum disorders. But ancient doctors did not have that vocabulary. They had the wandering womb. So a woman who came to a physician with panic attacks or fatigue would be told her womb was out of place. The diagnosis didn't just fail to help, it made her symptoms into a moral story about her failure to be a proper woman. That is perhaps the deepest struggle. It wasn't just the physical pain or the risk of death. It was living in a body that was constantly interpreted by people who did not inhabit it, using a theory that turned every symptom into evidence of female defect. And if she complained about the treatment, the diagnosis could absorb that too. She was emotional. Her uterus was acting up. She needed to marry. She needed to have a child. She needed to be quiet. But the women themselves were not passive. They did not simply accept every prescription. They used herbs. They helped each other through labor. They developed expertise. They told stories. We know this because the male authors occasionally let it slip. Soranus, for all his condescension, clearly relied on midwives. Pliny, for all his absurdity, records folk remedies that women actually used. The truth is that women were the first empiricists of their own reproductive lives. They tested things. They observed outcomes. They passed knowledge from mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice. The tragedy is that so much of that knowledge was lost because no one thought it worth recording. There was, however, one strange demographic truth. If a woman survived all those pregnancies and infections, she could outlive many men. Menopause, which we sometimes treat as a modern topic, was a real ancient event. Women who stopped menstruating might gain status, become midwives, manage households, or serve in religious roles. In some cultures, postmenopausal women were seen as wise elders. In others, they were feared as no longer under the control of the womb. But from a purely biological standpoint, reaching menopause meant she had survived the most dangerous years. Roman epitaphs sometimes record women dying in their 20s, with a husband and several children listed. The ones who lived to 60 or 70 were unusual. Their bodies had carried them through years of risk. And once the reproductive danger passed, some of them became the very people younger women turned to for help. The midwife, the grandmother, the woman who had seen it all. There is a quiet power in that survival. The ancient explanation of the wandering womb did not die with Rome. It evolved. In the Middle Ages, the theory became entangled with religion and sin. In the Renaissance, doctors argued about whether hysteria came from the uterus or the brain. In the Victorian era, hysteria was still a medical diagnosis for everything from fainting to sexual desire. Women were treated with rest cures, pelvic massage, and eventually surgery. The word survived into the 20th century. The idea behind it, that a woman's pain and emotions are suspect, rooted in her reproductive organs, never completely disappeared. Even now, research suggests that women's pain is often taken less seriously than men's. Women wait longer in emergency departments. Heart attack symptoms in women are more likely to be misdiagnosed as anxiety. Conditions like endometriosis, which causes severe menstrual pain, take years on average to diagnose. A modern woman with breathlessness and dizziness may still hear that it's stress before someone checks her heart. The ancient wandering womb has been replaced by better anatomy, But the reflex remains. When a woman's symptoms don't fit an easy story, the problem is sometimes located in her mind before it is located in her body. So why did the ancient world misunderstand women's bodies so badly? Partly because the people writing the medical texts were mostly men who did not experience menstruation, pregnancy, or menopause. Partly because the female reproductive system is genuinely complex and difficult to observe without modern tools. And partly because a bad explanation can survive for centuries if it flatters existing social arrangements. The wandering womb was not just a mistake, it was a useful mistake. It gave male authorities a reason to control women's behavior. It turned marriage and childbearing into medical treatments. It made female complaints into a form of disobedience. But the women themselves were there all along, doing the actual work, testing herbs, delivering babies, managing pain, surviving. The historical record simply refused to listen. So the next time you hear about the wandering womb as a silly ancient belief, remember what it hid. It hid real pain. It hid real fear. It hid real expertise. And it set a pattern that modern medicine is still trying to break. The smoke is gone. The reflex remains.